Good morning. The 7,919th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. On behalf of the Council, I would first like to offer my condolences to the government of Sweden and the victims of the senseless attack today in Stockholm. We have been reminded this week that the scourge of terrorism affects many countries, and we are united and share in our shared resolve. The situation in the provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted in accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. I invite the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Jeffrey Feltman, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda, and I will now give the floor to Mr. Jeffrey Feltman.
Madam President, thank you, and let me also convey on behalf of those of us at the Secretariat our condolences and our shock to our friends from Sweden for the attacks in Stockholm. The Secretary General is following this with great concern. Madam President, the Council's requested the Secretariat to provide an update on Syria. In addition, Special Envoy for Syria, Stefan de Mistura, will brief the Council in less than a week. I will therefore keep my remarks short. Madam President, in the last 2 months, we've seen the 30 December 2016 ceasefire falter amid a steady escalation of military activity. In mid-February, government forces escalated their military operations in several areas of Damascus and Homs, recapturing Wadi Barada and Al-Wara in Homs. Military advances were accompanied by large-scale evacuation of fighters and their families. The Syrian government cited the presence of al-Nusra Front in these areas, claims that were disputed by the opposition. Subsequently, during February and March, armed opposition groups, sometime coordinating with al-Nusra Front, launched offensives in Dara, Damascus, and Hama. On 4 April, as government forces were fighting to regain territory recently lost to opposition offensives in northern Hama, alarming reports emerged of an alleged chemical attack in nearby Khan Sheikhun in southern Idlib. Sources on the ground reported airstrikes. The Council, of course, discussed this in an emergency session on 5 April. The OPCW has announced that its fact-finding mission is starting to investigate the alleged Khan Sheikhun attack. The Secretary General, in a public statement, shared that he was abhorred by the chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhun and the death and injury of many innocent civilians. This morning at approximately 4:35 hours local time in Damascus, 7 April, 2 U.S. naval vessels deployed in the eastern Mediterranean Sea launched a total of 59 cruise missiles targeting the El Shairat military airbase in Homs Governorate. The United States has stated that this was in response to what it states was the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons from this airbase. The U.S. has claimed that the missiles severely damaged or destroyed Syrian aircraft and support infrastructure and equipment. According to news reports, the U.S. said that they had informed Russian Federation forces of the strike in advance, using the established deconfliction mechanism and taking precautions to minimize risk to Russian or Syrian personnel located at the airfield. A statement from the Syrian General Command of the Army and the Armed Forces called the act, quote, a blatant act of aggression, end quote, which had caused 6 deaths and quote, huge material damage, end quote. Iran and the Russian Federation condemned the attack. The UK, Australia, Germany, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, and New Zealand have expressed some support for the strikes. Madam President, the Security Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security. We hope that the Council can unite and exercise that responsibility to investigate the alleged use of chemical weapons in Khan Sheikhun. It's important that this Council sends a strong collective message that any use of chemical weapons shall not be tolerated and will have consequences. The Secretary General stresses that the international community has a responsibility to hold any perpetrator of chemical weapons attacks accountable and to ensure that chemical weapons are never again used as an instrument of warfare. The protection of civilians and accountability should be at the top of our peace and security agenda. In the case of Syria, there can be no genuine protection if the parties to the conflict, government and opposition alike, are permitted to act with impunity, and if the Syrian government continues to commit human rights violations against its own citizens. Protecting the Syrian people requires immediate action. Action is rooted in the principles of the United Nations and international law. Mindful of the risk of escalation, the Secretary General has publicly appealed for restraint to avoid any acts that could deepen the suffering of the Syrian people. We further urge all parties involved in military operations to abide by international humanitarian law and take all necessary precautions to avoid and minimize civilian casualties. Madam President, as the Secretary General has said, these events underscore our belief that there is no other way to solve the conflict than through a political solution. We call on the parties to renew urgently their commitment to making progress in the Geneva talks. Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015 and the Geneva Communique remain the foundation of and contain the core principles for United Nations mediation efforts and ultimately a solution in this regard. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Feltman. We will now take statements from council members, and we will start by giving the floor to the representative from Bolivia.
Señora Presidenta, muchas gracias.
Madam President, thank you for giving me the floor and also for convening this open meeting of the Security Council. It's vital that not only the members of our organization, but also the whole world should see that the positions of the members of the Security Council in a totally transparent way, given what has taken over recent days in Syria. Bolivia has called for the convening of this meeting. We are concerned at what has taken place over recent hours. While the Security Council was debating proposals on what would be the investigation mechanism for the horrendous chemical attacks which have been witnessed by all mankind, while we were discussing the words which could be used in a resolution to be considered by this council, and while the permanent and non-permanent members put forward proposals for the text of such a resolution, the United States was preparing once again and carried out a unilateral attack. The missile attacks, of course, is a unilateral action. They represent a serious threat to international peace and security. Why? Because over the last 70 years, mankind has been establishing, building a structure, not just a physical structure, not just an institutional structure, but also a legal structure. They have established instruments of international law to precisely prevent a situation in which the most powerful attack the weakest with impunity, and to ensure a balance in the world, and of course to avoid serious violations of international peace and security. We believe it to be the duty of this Security Council, but not just of the Security Council, of the United Nations organizations in all its bodies, to defend multilateralism. We are here to defend multilateralism. We have agreed that this charter, the United Nations Charter, must be respected. And this charter prohibits unilateral actions. Any action must be authorized by the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. Allow me to read a couple of articles so that we can remember this. Chapter 24 says that in order to ensure prompt and effective action by the United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and agree that in carrying out its duties under this responsibility, the Security Council acts on their behalf. This Security Council, not just the 15 members who are seated at this table, we represent the 193 member states of this organization, and through them we represent the people of the world. And we have agreed that unilateral actions violate international law. Now, as we were discussing yesterday, draft resolutions, while we were striving to come up with alternatives and come up with consensus in the Security Council, the United States not only has unilaterally attacked, but while we were just discussing here and demanding the need for an independent investigation, an impartial investigation, complete investigation into these attacks, the United States has become that investigator, has become the prosecutor, has become the judge, has become the jury. So where is the investigation which would allow us to establish in an objective manner who is responsible for the attacks? This is an extremely, extremely serious violation of international law. This is not the first time that this has happened. Throughout history, we can remember many episodes in which various powers, not just the United States, various powers have acted unilaterally and violated the UN Charter. But the fact that it's happened once again does not mean that the United Nations and its members must accept it. In September 2013, the United States also launched attacks against Syria. I recall what was said by the then Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, on that occasion. Allow me to read the quotation in English of what the Secretary General said. I quote,
"has primary responsibility for international peace and security. That's my appeal, that everything should be handled within the framework of the United Nations Charter. The use of force is lawful only when in exercise of self-defense in accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, and or when Security Council approves such action." Cierro comillas.
End of quote. This was the position of the Secretary General, the then Secretary General, which contributed to avoiding unilateral action be taken in very similar situations to what we are experiencing today. Now, this attack does represent a threat to international peace and security because it represents a threat to the political processes in Geneva and Astana. It was said very well by Mr. Feldman in the Secretary General's message that it is vital to avoid an escalation of tension, which breaks with the progress that has been achieved in Astana in Geneva. And said that this is not the first time that this has happened. And I'd like to recall what happened in this very Security Council just a few years ago, and specifically on Wednesday, the 5th of February 2003, when the then Secretary of State of the United States of America came to this room to present to us, according to his own words, convincing proof that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I believe that we must absolutely remember these pictures, and that in this very hall, we were told that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this was the motivation for an invasion. And that invasion, after this invasion, there was 1 million deaths and it launched a series of atrocities in that region. Could we talk about ISIS if that invasion had not taken place? Could we be talking about this series of horrendous attacks in various parts of the world had that invasion, this illegal invasion, not taken place? I believe it's vital for us to remember what history teaches us. And on this occasion, the United States did affirm. They found that they had all the proof necessary to show that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But they were never found. Never were they found. I'd like to repeat what was said. President Evo Morales this morning, and I quote, "I believe and I feel, I hope I'm not mistaken, that chemical weapons in Syria are just an excuse for a military intervention. The unilateral actions are imperialistic actions. The USA is not interested in international law. They ignore it when it's convenient to them. Internal problems of states must be resolved through dialogue and not through bombings. This is a threat to international peace and security." End of quote. I believe it's important to talk about the double standards when we're in the United Nations meeting rooms and then when we're dealing with actual real lives. In my own people, the people of the Latin America and the Caribbean, throughout history, we've lived this reality. We're talked about all these words about human rights, which we respect. But when the speeches about human rights are not in sync with their interests, then they violate these human rights. The series of coups d'etats in Latin America were organized, funded by the CIA. This is historic truth. This is not rhetoric, it's a truth. Let's remember the coup d'etat in 1973 against the constitutional government of Salvador Allende. This was financed by the CIA. Let's recall where the schools in Latin America where soldiers were taught how to torture people, and this was part of the training of Latin American soldiers as part of the so-called national security strategy. When we can talk about human rights, but when it doesn't meet our interests, then it's not important to talk about human rights. And the same goes for democracy. When it's in line with democracy, we defend democracy. But if not, then we fund coup d'etats. And the same is happening with the Security Council and with this very council. When it's not in line with their interests, then multilateralism is not important anymore. When it suits them, multilateralism is fine. The United Nations is fine. But when it doesn't, when their interests are not in line, well, they're not interested either in the United Nations or in human rights or in democracy. When we condemn unequivocally chemical attacks, we say that the Security Council must not be used as an echo chamber for interventionism. The Security Council should not be used as a pawn which can be sacrificed on a chessboard, the chessboard of war. This Security Council of the United Nations is the final hope that we have to guarantee international peace and security based upon principles, on norms and international rule of law. Madam President, also I'd like to point out that it's absolutely vital, as you have convened this meeting in a very transparent way, that we demonstrate the concern that unfortunately there are first-class and second-class members in the Security Council, the permanent members which not only have the right to the veto, but they also control the procedures, they control the decision-making. And the other 10, well, we may be involved if we are consulted or if we are convened occasionally, not just to just to underwrite some positions of others. This is not multilateralism. Bolivia would like to reiterate its robust condemnation of the use of chemical weapons or the use of chemical precursors in weapons to conduct criminal acts, irrespective of their motivation, wherever it may be, wherever it may be, and by whomsoever it may be committed. And we do reiterate that we demand, when these cases took place, that there should be independent, impartial, and conclusive investigations. Unfortunately, the attacks yesterday have given a mortal attack on the joint investigative mechanism and against the organization for the provision of chemical weapons so that they can undertake an investigation and find out exactly what did take place a couple of days ago in Iraq. The person responsible must be prosecuted and punished under the law, and the same with any violations of international law and which threaten international security. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of Bolivia. And now we will give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. I deeply regret that the previous speaker showed more outrage against the United States than against the Assad regime that on Tuesday deliberately dropped chemical weapons, killing over 100 men, women, and children in the most barbaric fashion. More than 3.5 years ago, the Syrian regime made a pledge. They would join the 189 countries who had already signed the Chemical Weapons Convention. They would reveal the full extent of their chemical arsenal and proceed with its full destruction. What spurred this pledge was a chemical weapons attack, that time in Ghouta. Hundreds, if not thousands, were dead. There were images of men, women, and children choking, foaming at the mouth, clearly asphyxiated. Three and a half years after a historically heinous war crime was committed, after the stockpiles were supposed to be destroyed, Assad, on Tuesday, showed us yet again, this time in Idlib, that he is capable of redefining horror. Tuesday's attack must be fully investigated. Impunity cannot be the norm. We will continue to work with our partners on this Security Council to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. The United Kingdom supports the US airstrike on the Al-Shairat airfield because war crimes have consequences, and the greatest war criminal of all, Bashar al-Assad, has now been put on notice. The US strike was a proportionate response to unspeakable acts that gave rise to overwhelming humanitarian distress. It was also a strong effort to save lives by ensuring that such acts never happen again. The resolution that we adopted 3.5 years ago provided a framework for the destruction of chemical weapons in Syria. It had a clear author and a clear guarantor. At the time, Russia assured us that Assad would fully declare his chemical arsenal and would continue to cooperate with international inspectors. Perhaps that was the assurance that Russia received from Assad. And perhaps Russia has now learnt the hard lesson that backing a war criminal comes with its own consequence, humiliation. Russia has barely any support from the Arab world for its policy of propping up the criminal Assad regime as it carries out chemical weapons attacks against its own people. Russia needs to listen to this council, listen to the Arab world, listen to the rest of the international community. Above all, listen to the Syrian people. Their message is clear. End Assad's bombs, his use of chemical weapons, his torture dungeons. Instead, Russia has given Assad everything he could dream of. Without Russia's 7 vetoes in the Security Council, defying the views of other members of this council, Assad would now have faced sanctions and justice. And what did Russia get for its unconditional support? Assad ignores Russia's requests for him to obey a ceasefire. Assad defies Russia's request for him not to gas his own people. Assad thumbs his nose at Russia's calls for Assad to join a peace process. Russia sits here today humiliated by its failure to bring to heel a puppet dictator entirely propped up by Russia itself and Hezbollah and Iran. Let me bust some myths about our private negotiations over the last couple of days. We were seeking agreement on a draft resolution. I repeatedly asked the Russian Federation, why could you not support our draft resolution? If you want the truth, why did you not want the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to have access to the places, the people, and the information they need? What possible excuse do you have for keeping that information away from the investigators? What reason do you have to carry on protecting Assad? If you care about the UN Charter, why protect a dictator who has violated international law time and time again? Answer came there none. There is another way for Russia, and I appeal to the Russian Federation to abandon its failed strategy, to join the rest of this Council in our call for justice and accountability, to end your protection of a war criminal, to join us, all of us, in supporting a genuine political progress that would lead to a transition to a more legitimate and representative government. The only reason why we are here, why these discussions are being had in this moment, in this chamber, is because the international community has not done enough. Things can be different. The difference that can be made, the difference that must be made, lies in a political solution. And that won't happen if we take the familiar route that has plagued this council and the countries of the region, millions of Syrians looking for a future. The new road must see the Syrian regime engage. The new road must have Russia and Iran not only at the table, but negotiating in good faith. We are sitting in the halls of the organization that was built to guide us when peace seems out of reach. The United Nations has a vital role in convening those negotiations and helping the parties to resolve their disputes. The agenda has been set, and it is long overdue that a proper negotiation on the future Syrian-led transition that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people happens. Assad must engage in serious discussion about that future to meet those aspirations of all Syrians. Madam President, in conclusion, the United Kingdom supports the US action as an appropriate response to a heinous act by a brutal and uncaring dictator, by a dictator who thinks that gassing his people is somehow a legitimate step on the road to stability. It is time now to get a genuine political process back up and running. Those discussions may be long and difficult, but the people of Syria deserve nothing less. And if we want to ensure that the shocking images that have haunted us this week are truly confined to history, then this is our duty. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative from the United Kingdom, and now I'll give the floor to the representative from Egypt.
السيد الرئيس.
Madam President, we have followed with great concern the repercussions of the Khan Sheikhoun incident, which claimed the lives of dozens of innocent Syrian civilians. Many reports have confirmed that this incident was the result of the use of chemical weapons once again in Syria. We have also followed the dangerous developments related to the recent escalation on the Syrian scene last night. Madam President, the Khan Sheikhoun incident and other incidents and crimes in Syria over the past 7 years are a clear indication of the absence of conscience. They are a living proof that the people of the region, especially the Syrian people, are the main victim of a proxy war that has paralyzed the international community. Serious dialogue has been absent after many parties decided to fall back on their narrow interests, as if the death of hundreds and thousands of civilians and the displacement of millions of Syrians are but collateral damage, which will be dealt with later on after the puppeteers of this war reach a political deal in line with their interests. I believe, frankly, that the disagreements and the competition within this council, sometimes on issues not related to Syria, have meant an increasing number of innocent civilians killed day after another. We are fed up with the statements of regret and condemnation by the international community following every humanitarian tragedy that has befallen the Syrian people. We are fed up with these statements because they have become empty slogans, mere words that are not coupled by any genuine and serious international effort that would meet the interest of the Syrian people and would have a genuine effect on their daily lives. Therefore, I insist that everyone abandon these disagreements and these altercations and to focus in the future on the way out of this Syrian maze. All parties at the international, regional, and Syrian level should support an immediate ceasefire and should move forward seriously and objectively and without any preconditions or procedural maneuvers with the intra-Syrian negotiations under the auspices of the United Nations in Geneva. We believe that the Syrian people are capable of determining their own future. However, achieving the aspirations of Syrians to democracy, reconstruction, and stability is impossible without a genuine international support that would contain the negative repercussions of the spoilers and would assist Syrians to combat terrorism in Syria and to build their own state on strong and stable foundations. Maybe the time has come to be frank. I would call on the United States and the Russian Federation in particular, given their abilities and given their co-chairmanship of the ISSG and their influence on the different parties locally and regionally, I call on them to move actively in this direction based on Security Council resolutions to reach a middle ground and a political settlement in Syria. I urge them to resume their coordination and cooperation in the field and politically to salvage what can be salvaged and to avoid further deterioration. Madam President, in closing, I stress that the Syrian settlement is possible only based on clear and genuine intentions. Egypt will deal positively with any honest and serious action to save Syria from this abyss and to contain the implications of this crisis on the present and the future of the region. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of Egypt, and now we will give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Thank you, Madam President. We'd also like to thank USG Feldman for his briefing and the message from the Secretary General. Madam President, for several decades now, we've seen so many terrible attacks, and the British coined an expression which really is apposite today in English.
And carry on.
That's the expression in English. And I think that today, more than ever before, we need to keep calm and continue doing our work. Because the Syrian conflict has been very long and is very complicated, and it has to be kept in the multilateral sphere. And it is this Council that has the main responsibility to address this. We must reactivate and strengthen the political willingness of the three possible scenarios that we've been dealing with here in the Council: the negotiations in Geneva, the negotiations in Astana for the ceasefire, and to contain the use of violence, and of course the discussions here in the Security Council. The principles that have guided Uruguay internationally are deeply rooted in our country as a small country without armed forces that threaten anyone. And therefore, the non-use of force in international relations is a guiding cardinal principle for Uruguay. And we only accept the use of force in accordance with the principles of international law and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. Any other use of force for Uruguay is illegitimate. Uruguay has always rejected the unilateral use of force throughout our history, and most recently, if you will, the invasions in Korea in the 50s, and invasions of Hungary, forces against Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Iraq, Iran. We've always rejected the unilateral use of force. Uruguay hopes that this individual incident, which is set against the background of the main powers being unable to solve the conflict in Syria, we hope that this situation does not escalate into further attacks, and that the parties will refrain from further actions that will worsen the situation and that will lead to an endless spiral of violence, which could also flow over directly or indirectly into other countries. For Uruguay, we have to look at this overall in terms of international law, and another fundamental principle here is the absolute respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In recent years, we've seen in Syria the most atrocious crimes committed against the civilian population. The investigations carried out by the Joint Investigative Mechanism have demonstrated the use of chemical weapons by both the Syrian government as well as by terrorist groups of ISIS and Daesh. The last example was the horrendous attack in March of chemical weapons, a war crime that should receive the most robust possible condemnation of the international community. The use of chemical weapons is a threat to international peace and security. But in the midst of all of this, we mustn't forget, Madam President, the responsibility of this Council in identifying those responsible for chemical weapons attacks in Kanchi. Up until a few hours ago, this Council was intensively negotiating to adopt a resolution that would facilitate an investigation being carried out to know who is responsible for those last attacks. And now, more than ever before, the Council must face its responsibilities to clarify that incident and ask for accountability for these abhorrent crimes. We must also, Madam President, reflect about the situation that this Council finds itself in because of the existence of the privilege of the veto in adoption of resolutions. And also the aggravation of the use of the veto, or the threat of the use of the veto, and the veto on resolutions relating to crimes against humanity. Uruguay, as part of the ACTA group, calls once again for the control and the commitment of the members of this council to not use the veto in situations of this kind. The use of the veto removes the effectiveness of the council, the operational nature of the council, and further imbalances the work of this organ. We reiterate, Madam President, that we feel it's important to resume all negotiations underway, multilateral negotiations, to bring about a solution to the conflict which is afflicting the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of Uruguay, and now we will give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, Madam President, let me express our solidarity to the government of Sweden and our condolences for the victims of the attack this morning in Stockholm. Madam President, it bears repeating the attack conducted on Khan Sheikhoun on 4 April was ruthless and cruel for the high death toll caused, including many children. It is a vile action that Italy and the European Union have firmly condemned, and that add on to Assad reiterated violations of the ceasefire and the violence repeatedly perpetrated by his armed forces on civilians. Our government, the government of Italy, is closely following the events unfolding in the Mediterranean in consideration of its many and direct interests in the stability of the region, where we are also playing a role as a security provider for the international community. As Foreign Minister Alfano stated this morning, Italy understands the reasons of a US military action, proportionate in time and manner, in response to a prolonged sense of impunity that is completely unacceptable. It is also a sign of deterrence against the risk of a further use of chemical weapons in Syria, in addition to the cases already ascertained by the United Nations, for which there should have been already a prompt and meaningful response, including in terms of accountability, which this Council must continue to seek. Madam President, it is now, we think, necessary and urgent to reunite all the main actors involved in the Syrian crisis and work together to finally achieve a political solution that takes the Syrian people out of the tragedy they have been suffering for the past 6 years. We think we must look forward. Italy calls for the international community to continue and redouble its efforts to achieve a UN-led political transition in Syria in compliance with Resolution 2254 of this Security Council and the 2012 Geneva Communique. It remains the only way out of the crisis and the only way to avoid further violence and further tragedies in the country. We believe it is now necessary that all parties leverage all their influence to facilitate a real ceasefire, ensure full access to humanitarian aid, and promote a process aimed at progressively building trust between the Syrian parties. All different tracks of the Syrian issue, non-proliferation of chemical weapons, cessation of hostilities, fight against terrorism, humanitarian access, and the political talks can only advance if this Security Council is united. As an elected member of this Council, Italy will continue to work towards this strategic goal. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of Italy, and I will now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, my statement is an extension of the joint communique published last night by the President of the French Republic, Monsieur François Hollande, and the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Madame Angela Merkel. I would also like to begin by expressing once again to Sweden our deep condolences and our full solidarity with you after the tragic terrorist attack in Stockholm this morning. Madam President, the Security Council is meeting once again following the use of chemical weapons by the regime of Bashar al-Assad, almost 4 years after the large-scale massacre in Ghouta in August 2013. The 4th of April attack has dropped the masks. They've come off. Assad has never renounced the use of chemical weapons and has never deviated from his ultimate goal, the annihilation, quite simply, of all those who resist him, whatever the price may be. France consistently has called for strong action on the part of the international community in the face of serious and repeated violations of international humanitarian law by the Damascus regime, which constitute war crimes and even crimes against humanity, as was already underscored by the Secretary-General of the United Nations in 2013 after the chemical attack of the 21st of August 2013. My country has spared no effort to ensure that these crimes do not go unpunished, including by proposing that the Security Council of the United Nations go to the International Criminal Court. These initiatives, however, have met with the Russian veto. In particular, the Syrian regime violated its international commitments arising from its membership of the agreement on the use and storage of chemical weapons and the need to destroy them. The actions of Syria are also a clear violation of the decisions of the Security Council. In this context, the American strikes constitute a legitimate response to this chemical attack, and at the same time are an important signal for the future, indicating that the use of such weapons will not be tolerated. Those that pretend to be shocked by this can know that Bashar al-Assad is completely responsible for what has happened. For years now, the regime has openly flouted the basic principles of collective security. For years now, he's violated repeatedly and systematically his obligations with regard to international humanitarian law, the legal prohibition of recourse to chemical weapons, in particular against civilian populations, and resolutions of the Security Council. It had become absolutely essential to react and to deter him from this action. Madam President, recourse by anyone to chemical weapons constitutes a crime, war crime, and possibly a crime against humanity, and this cannot go unpunished, and Syria can be no exception. This was already the position of France the day after the chemical attack in Ghouta, and we have never deviated from this position. The international community can no longer be fooled by delaying tactics of the Assad regime. In adopting Resolution 2118, the Security Council clearly committed itself to sanction any failure on the part of Syria to meet its obligations. This did not prevent the regime of Bashar al-Assad from pursuing since 2013 the repeated methodological and barbaric use of weapons of mass destruction, openly flouting the authority of this Council and its international commitments. These violations have been irrefutably documented by a United Nations mechanism created by the Security Council, the JIM. On the 28th of February last, the action of the Security Council once again was prevented by the unjustified use by Russia of the veto. This impasse was seen by the Assad regime as a sign of impunity, and in parallel, Russia has not met its responsibilities and has not exercised the necessary pressure that it should have done on the regime in Damascus. Today, it is the responsibility of the members of the Council, of all members of the Council, to ensure that all possible light be shed on the attack that was carried out by the Syrian regime in Khan Sheikhoun and ensure that the perpetrators of this act are brought to justice. France renews its full support to the UN mechanisms and the OPCW to carry out a diligent inquiry in this regard. We will not resign ourselves to the disintegration of the chemical non-proliferation regime, and we will continue to work with our partners to strengthen this in all appropriate fora. Madam President, the attack of the 4th of April will have proven once and for all to the world the urgent need for a political solution in Syria. The maintenance in power of a dictator multiplying chemical attacks against civilian populations is not only a moral abomination, it is an untenable threat to the region and to the world. All members of this Council agree on one thing. The Syrian crisis will never be solved through military means alone. After the tragedy of Khan Sheikhoun, more than ever before, we now have the moral and political responsibility to give decisive dynamism to the Geneva talks under the aegis of the United Nations. It is the top priority, and France, in this regard, would call upon the international community to coalesce around a political transition in Syria in accordance with Resolution 2254 of the Security Council and the Geneva Communiqué of the 30th of June 2012. France and its European partners will be tabling proposals in this regard. Madam President, our responsibility is to history. Every member of the Security Council, and in particular Russia, must face up to all of their responsibilities, and we must commit ourselves to seeking an urgent political solution. It's an urgent matter, since we are talking about the security of the Syrian people and the region, and also the effective fight against terrorism is at stake. Let's not forget, Assad's Syria is the strongest generator for terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative of France, and now we will give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. The Syrian conflict has been lasting for 7 years, having led to large amount of casualties of innocent civilians. China would like to be empathetic to the profound sufferings of the Syrian people. The present situation will not last any longer. Fast action has to be taken to resort to dialogue and consultation for appropriate solutions, so as to help Syrian people to lift themselves out of suffering at an early date, to lead a peaceful and stable life at an early date, and to help Syria rebuild the country at an early date. China has always been consistently standing for dialogue and consultation to resolve international conflicts. What is urgently needed at present is that all parties make efforts to prevent the situation in Syria from further deterioration. Political solution is the only way out for the Syrian issue. Military means will not work. They will only worsen the suffering of the Syrian people, so that the situation in Syria and the region will be more complicated and turbulent, which is not at all in the common interests of Syria, the regional countries, and the international community. China calls upon all relevant parties to persist firmly in diplomatic efforts and to stick firmly to political solution for the Syrian issue, stick to dialogue and consultation in a firm way, and support the role of the United Nations as the main mediation channel and good offices and the efforts of Special Envoy de Mistura so as to take forward the progress in Geneva talks. Therefore, we can maintain all efforts to maintain the hard-won momentum for political solution of the Syrian question. Recent days has seen some complicated new situations appearing in certain areas of Syria. International community must remain highly alert to these relevant developments. We have to stick to uniform criteria in fighting against all the terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of China, and now I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Madam President, I join others in expressing my sincere condolences to the families of the victims of the attack in Stockholm. Sorry. Thank you very much, Madam President. I will start again. I join others in expressing my sincere condolences to the families of the victims of the attack in Stockholm this morning and our solidarity with the people of Sweden. Now, turning to Syria, the use of chemical weapons is not permissible under any circumstances. 3 days ago, we faced another shocking report that many innocent civilians became the victims of chemical weapons in Syria. The act is extremely inhumane and violates relevant Security Council resolutions. The government of Japan supports the determination of the United States government to never allow the spread and use of chemical weapons. We understand that the United States took the action last night in order to prevent further aggravation of the situation. The Council must reaffirm its determination to address the reported use of chemical weapons in Idlib. Japan once again urges the OPCW FFM to expeditiously conduct an investigation and report its conclusions as soon as possible so that the OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism, JIM, can conduct its own investigation in order to identify those who are responsible. Madam President, in conclusion, Japan reiterates its position that there is no military solution for Syria, and we must advance the political process based on Security Council Resolution 2254. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative from Japan, and now we will give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, first of all, the permanent representative of Sweden, please accept our deep condolences on the tragedy that took place in Stockholm. On the night of the 7th of April, the United States attacked the territory of sovereign Syria. We describe that attack as a flagrant violation of international law and an act of aggression. We strongly condemn the illegitimate actions by the US. The consequences of this for regional and international stability could be extremely serious. This attack was a flagrant violation of the 2015 memorandum on preventing incidents and ensuring security during air operations in Syrian airspace, and the Ministry of Defense of Russia has stopped its cooperation with Pentagon under that memorandum. Over recent times, the United States administration has often talked about the need to combat international terrorism, and this justified American troops and their allies being present on Syrian territory, although they were there without the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria and without the approval of the Security Council of the United Nations, manipulating articles of the United Nations Charter beyond any criticism. The aggression by the US has only facilitated the strengthening of terrorism. The attack came against Syrian armed forces infrastructure and its air force. That is, against those who over all these years have been combating terrorism. It's not difficult to imagine how much the spirits of these terrorists have been raised after this support from Washington. Immediately after the attack, there were massive attacks by ISIL and al-Nusra against Syrian military sites. Once again, we repeat, and once again, we repeat that the Syrian armed forces will and will continue to be the main anti-terrorist institute of the Syrian Arab Republic. Who will fight against terrorism? These illegal armed groups who have come to Syria in hundreds of thousands? You've destroyed Iraqi military Libyan military bases, and see what's happened. In fact, these actions contradict international decisions, including the Geneva Communique, which we designed together with you. And there it says, it talks about settlement while maintaining national institutions. Is that the sort of national institutions that you are supporting? The Russian Federation, from the United Nations organization, has stated the need to establish an international coalition to counteract terrorism, which would be on the basis of international law. And on many occasions, we've sent signals to Washington of our readiness to undertake such cooperation. As we see it, you have chosen a different path. We must recall, when you take your own path, that this leads to horrible tragedies for countries in the region and the people living there. Think of the consequences. Remember that what you have produced in the Middle East. Think of your steps and how they have impacted on the political settlement process in Syria. Now, today's appeal to move forward the political process, they are hypocritical after this military attack, unfortunately. Now, on the Astana and Geneva tracks over recent days, there have been clear progress. Now, what aims guided you when you undermined this progress? And the progress that was achieved was not thanks to you at all. Now, returning to the history of chemical weapons, now, in Syria, the US and the UK and France came up with a draft resolution. It was greatly erroneous in its very logic. It was based on predetermining Damascus being guilty. But where's your principle of assuming innocence? Why don't your capitals recall this in Middle East and in other regions? Why do you forget the presumption of innocence in these cases? Now, all this is taking place because Washington, London, and Paris, I spoke about this in close consultation, and I say this again, have this paranoid idea of overthrowing the legitimate government in sovereign Syria. And this was clearly shown by the non-diplomatic actions and the statements made by the UK Perm Rep. Mr. Rycroft, stop putting forward these unprofessional arguments and accusations against my country. These are not diplomatic. They are lies. Once again, I warn, don't even try to get into fights with in the Arab world. Nothing will work, and nothing will be achieved. That's why you're getting annoyed. All Arab countries. Recall your colonial hypocrisy. Now, the Ambassador Rycroft, in his statement, talked about issues, and I'd like to recall exactly what has happened. Now, those who undertook this attack are in no way interested in an impartial investigation by a competent international authority to find out exactly what took place in Han Shaikun. And I will say even more. You are afraid of such an investigation. You are afraid of a real, genuine, independent investigation. What would happen if the outcome of this investigation would contradict your anti-government paradigm? You would be afraid of investigations of what took place in other places. Now, Hamshikul, the permanent representative of the USA, said that there is witness from the intelligence services of the USA that the government forces use chemical weapons. And we said, show us. Specialists will see whether this is the case or not. But we will recall that General Power, I believe in this very room, he talked about chemical weapons of mass destruction were not found. Let's work either with professionals or just work with ultimatums. We're living in a very complex and multipolar world. It's difficult to live in this world. But Russia has proposed to its partners on the Security Council constructive alternative. But you had nothing to accept. There was no professional alternative. You didn't put forward any good arguments to us. And specifically, our initiative was based on the appeal for specialists on a geographical basis, and the OPCW fact-finding mechanism, and the OPCW-UN investigation mission for chemical weapons in Syria, to call that group together on our initiative and to visit the site where this incident took place in Khan Shaikun and the neighboring areas to conduct professional investigation. Now, all Syrian parties were asked to give immediate access to where the events took place. It's not irrelevant to recall that the Syrian government does not control this area of Idlib province. There are battle-hardened groups from outside who are closely related to terrorist groups of Nursa. And they have things to hide, including in the context of the chemical dossier. But you're trying to hide this again. Again, as you showed in Aleppo. But when Aleppo was freed, everything became clear. It's no coincidence that the complaints against Syria of chemical weapons and their storage by extremists in special warehouses, and they're being used by the army and civilians, has just been ignored, or it's been studied for month after month without any outcome. The OPCW, the fact-finding mission, does not work in a conscientious manner. They prefer to come up with statements of opposition groups, internet blogs, social networks, and a whole range of NGOs of a very doubtful reputation. And they work with information and evidence from the areas where the events took place. They don't even look at that evidence. And they want us to agree with this information. It's not even worth looking at. Now, in our draft, we also set out the need to establish a balanced, in geographical terms, staffing of the investigation group. It's an important point, and it has a direct relationship to the issue of impartiality and trust. So far, the fact-finding mission experts have been made up of group representatives from one country who are in the forefront of the anti-Damascus parties. Now, proof of the blatant double standards is the ignoring of the chemical attack carried out by terrorists in the Middle East as a whole. Recall the recent events in Mosul, in Iraq. Where is the international community's reaction? Where was your warning? First and foremost, to those who are establishing this headline action in Han Sheikhoun. Are these victims of a different category? Second-class victims? Why do we not see in the headlines of your newspapers the tragedy in this besieged town of Mosul? And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Therefore, the attack in Syria is an attempt to distract attention from the many victims amongst the peaceful population in Iraq and Syria caused by unilateral actions. And they are attacking homes and civilian targets. So humanitarian corridors make no sense. Let's recall the little girl, Havra. She lived in Mosul. You didn't say absolutely any word about this little girl who became a symbol of this tragedy. And when a coalition bomb fell on her house, everybody around her was killed. Thank God, the girl remained alive, but her life had to be fought for. Now her life is out of danger, but she's almost blind. We will not, in this room, set up a cynical show and hold up photographs, but the Mosul tragedy must be publicized. People must know about it. Nothing is said about Mosul. And we do not want, when we talk about Mosul, draw attention from Syria. Those who know our position on this, we know that this is a lie. We do not wish to draw attention of anybody from anything, particularly what terrorists are doing. We just merely want to tell you that if we are fighting terrorism, let's do it on standards. War principles or any other principles, or don't try, let me once again, to argue with ourselves in Iraq. You will not get us involved in that. Look at what you are doing in Iraq and what we are doing. The 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council did attempt to find a compromise last evening on the consultations which we called for. They thanked the American delegation for the fact that a vote had been postponed, but there was nothing to thank them for. Our colleagues didn't even imagine that the decision was made with totally different ideas in mind. It was not with the idea of continuing constructive dialogue. Washington had already chosen to take military action, which was undertaken when members of the Security Council had hardly left the UN building. We call upon the United States to immediately cease its aggression and to join those efforts being made for a political settlement in Syria and to work together to combat the terrorist threat. In that sort of cooperation, we are ready to undertake such cooperation. Today, many insulting words have been heard with regard to our right to veto, our right, which we have used in a responsible manner, but we use it only in such circumstances when you try in the Security Council to impose your irresponsible geopolitical project. The Security Council must develop agreed international decisions. but these geopolitical adventures will never be supported. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the representative of the Russian Federation. And now we will give the floor to the representative of Senegal.
Madame la Présidente. Madam President, I wanted to express my deepest condolences through our colleague Olaf to the people and government.
For the representative of Senegal. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam President. Before beginning my statement, I would like to express my sincere condolences, sympathy of the Senegalese delegation through the Swedish ambassador Olaf to all of the Swedish people and its government for the tragic terrorist attack that took place this morning. Madam President, here we are meeting in an urgent session today, 48 hours only, following a meeting in the same format that brought us here on the 4th of April. But just as on the 4th of April and as yesterday, late into the evening, we still today are seeing a deep division within our Security Council with regard to the Syrian crisis, which with the use of chemical weapons, with the proliferation of terrorist groups, has disastrous, unprecedented consequences and is the most serious conflict of the moment. What image are we sending out to the international community? And above all, what message are we sending out to the Syrian people? That we have lost direction. What ambiguous message are we sending out as well to the terrorists that are mushrooming up in Syria? Madam President, nothing can justify an atrocity such as the use of chemical weapons being used against civilians, even in a period of conflict. We are a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and we repeat our firm condemnation of the employment of all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons. My delegation would like to further encourage the OPCW in its work, particularly with regard to its fact-finding mission, and commend its efforts attempting to bring together and analyze all the information available in order to determine who is responsible for what. Last September, in this very chamber, the President of Senegal said in this room that there can be no military solution to this crisis. And that is why my delegation reaffirms our strong conviction that only a negotiated solution on the basis of the Geneva Communiqué and Resolution 2254 can make it possible to find a final outcome to this conflict. And we mustn't forget, it needs to be political, security, humanitarian, and also non-proliferation. All those aspects have to be covered in this agreement. And my delegation wishes every success to the 5th round of talks in Geneva, opened on the 23rd of March this year, with the hope that with the praiseworthy efforts of Special Envoy Mr. Mistura, who's going to brief us here next week, that these talks will lead to substantial conclusions during the 4th meeting that made it possible for the first time to address substantial issues such as constitutional reform, political transition, and the holding of elections under the observation of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Senegal, and now we'll turn the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. I join others in expressing our heartfelt condolences to our Swedish colleagues on terrorist act in Stockholm. My delegation is greatly concerned by recent developments and absence of unity of the Council members on chemical attack in Syria, and we would like to make the following observations and recommendations on the critical political aspect with regard to the situation in Syria. We call on all parties concerned to refrain from actions that could increase the risks of a military escalation of tension in Syria. We would like to emphasize that the lack of unanimity may liquidate new hopes of the Syrian people, which arise from the historical resolution 2336. We should not undermine an inclusive political negotiating process as provided for in Resolution 2254. Geneva 5, held from 23rd to 31st of March, were able this time to move from discussing formal and procedural issues to the substantive and political aspects of future peace talks. In this regard, we simply cannot allow ceasefire to dissolve as our last chance to realize the long-awaited peace on the Syrian land. We consider gas attacks in Syria as a crime against humanity and strongly condemn the use of chemical weapons. It is important to have a thorough, objective, and impartial investigation into all aspects of the chemical attack on Han Sheikhoun on April 4th this year, which will allow the international community to make a fair verdict against the perpetrators in full compliance with international law. We would like to remind that the principal position of Kazakhstan is not only the most severe condemnation of the use of weapons of mass destruction by any party, especially against the civilian population, but also the resolution of conflicts exclusively by peaceful means. We also have to respect the sovereignty of states that are member states of the UN and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. All the more we urgently need political solution. Only political diplomatic solution can bring peace in Syria, and we call on international community to exert political will to overcome differences and negotiate peace in Syria. The legitimate authorities of the Syrian Arab Republic, as well as other parties, must thoroughly execute their obligations of complying with the relevant recommendations by OPCW and UN, by accepting personnel designated by them, while providing for and ensuring the security of activities undertaken by this personnel, by providing this personnel with immediate and unfettered access to and the right to inspect, in charging their functions, any and all sites, and by allowing immediate and unfettered access to individuals that the OPCW has grounds to believe to be of importance for the purpose of its mandate. The crisis in Syria that is still unfolding has its impact not only on the region, but the whole international community. Kazakhstan therefore believes that the regional approach involving neighboring countries which have influence on parties in Syria, conflict, should be considered as a very effective method in mitigating the situation and preventing further deterioration. There is a strong need to continue supporting the aims of the Astana and further Geneva negotiations in order to see positive outcomes. We welcome significant results of the successful ministerial level conference held this April in Brussels, which was chaired by the EU and the UN and attended by many IGOs and NGOs. It is encouraging with the pledges made and sending a message of solidarity to the people of Syria and all those impacted by the conflict. The meeting will increase the amount of the much-needed essential humanitarian assistance provided to the Syrian people, which is the most important to achieve our political objectives. Finally, Madam President, I conclude by quoting Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who at the opening session of the Supporting Syria and the Region Conference in Brussels said, "The most difficult times call for the greatest efforts." And I would add, and also the greatest of compromises. I thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Kazakhstan, and now we'll give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to say first that I'm really heartened by all the expressions of condolences and sympathies that are coming in as we speak on my telephone from all our friends in the hall this morning. Thank you very much for that. Madam President, thank you for convening the meeting. Very important. As we stated 2 days ago in this chamber, the alleged use of chemical weapons in the attack in Khan Sheikhoun was abhorrent and unacceptable. If these allegations are proven to be correct, it will unfortunately be no surprise. The Joint Investigative Mechanism has concluded that chemical weapons have been used by the Syrian regime on at least 3 occasions. This latest attack only adds to the many other confirmed cases of international crimes committed in the Syrian conflict by all parties, most notably the Syrian regime. chemical weapons use is clearly illegal, constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and can amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. There must be no impunity for such atrocities. Madam President, Sweden has been extremely clear that the attack in Khan Sheikhoun must be condemned in the strongest terms, that there needs to be a rapid, full and impartial investigation to confirm the use of chemical weapons, and that those responsible for this horrendous attack must be held to account. This is why we've worked tirelessly over the last days to ensure the adoption by this Council of a strong resolution on a robust and immediate investigation into this outrage. While these efforts did not bear fruit yesterday, we still hope there is enough common ground for this Council to move forward on a strong resolution. Efforts should continue, and we will remain constructively and actively engaged. With regard to the US airstrike last night in response to the 4th of April attack, it is important that action is based on international law. Last night's missile attack also does raise questions on its compatibility with international law. As the Secretary General said, restraint is important to avoid any risk of escalation now. Madam President, Sweden has championed accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. We voted in favor of the draft resolution on accountability for use of chemical weapons on 28 February. We endorsed EU targeted measures against these implicated in the use of chemical weapons. We support the JIM, including through financial support and technical expertise. We have actively supported the Commission of Inquiry led by Professor Pinheiro. We co-sponsor the GA resolution to set up the international impartial and independent mechanism that will begin, we hope, its work very soon. And we have provided support through an initial contribution of almost $400,000 to this mechanism. Madam President, instead of exchanging accusations and insults around this table, we now need to come together to urgently reinvigorate the UN-led political process. Ultimately, the only way of ending the suffering in Syria is by achieving a sustainable political solution. This will require a transitional political process based on Resolution 2254. We reiterate our full support for the intra-Syrian talks under UN auspices in Geneva and the efforts of Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura, who we look forward to hearing from next week. The parties must engage seriously. Over the last days, we have expressed our outrage over the latest atrocity, this time in Khan Sheikhoun. Yet, every day, the Syrian people continue to suffer the brutality of war in all its forms. It is high time to end the war in Syria and that the Syrian people are allowed to determine their own future. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative of Sweden, and I will now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Madam President. Thanks for organizing this meeting. Let me express our condolences to the government of Sweden and to our Swedish colleagues. We condemn the terrorist attack. Now proceeding to the 2-3 points that I wanted to raise. First, if this situation in Syria continues and the result would be the collapse of the Syrian state, those who would win would be the terrorists. We have no doubt there. We have seen it too many times. This perhaps is another indication that the international community has no united stand on giving priority for resolving the Syrian crisis through political dialogue and countering the scourge of terrorism in a united and concerted manner. But this said, there is no justification for the crime committed on April 4. Second, there is a very urgent issue that requires clarification and handling with wisdom. And that has to do with the fact that too many states and non-state actors are very much active in Syria. Who doesn't know that Syria has been an open field for quite some time? The point is, the situation has been worsening and nobody knows what might happen tomorrow. Therefore, what we are facing is a much broader and much complicated matter, which is likely to easily go out of hand. The priority now in our mind should be to find a way out before one gets to the slippery slope. This is the time for wisdom to prevail and for statesmanship to take the upper hand. One doubts that has been the case for some time. What the Secretary General said today is worth referring to. He said, among other things, and I quote, "The Security Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security. I call on the Council to unite and exercise that responsibility. For too long," he continues, "international law has been ignored in the Syrian conflict, and it is our shared duty to uphold international standards of humanity. Third, there is a danger that the Security Council, which is already being marginalized, might lose whatever remaining credibility it might have. That's why the action taken by the E10 yesterday looks, in hindsight, not only very timely, but also wise. Thus, would the proposal made yesterday by the E10 help find a way out for what otherwise could be a dangerous development? We believe it might. In light of the fact that the rationale for this latest military action is the use of chemical weapons, and who is responsible has still to be conclusively demonstrated, and the investigation has to be speeded up and concluded, it seems to us the priority now should be the adoption by consensus of the draft by the E10. And also, as Egypt said, for the US and the Russian Federation to exercise greater responsibility and find a way out which is not beyond their capacity. Finally, as we said 2 days ago, it's only an inclusive political process that could ultimately address the Syrian crisis and prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. That is why there is need for calm and restraint to de-escalate the situation. We hope that these latest developments will not dampen the prospect for comprehensive political solution in Syria through the intra-Syrian talks in Geneva. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you to the representative from Ethiopia, and now we will give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. We were also really shocked by the terrorist act in Stockholm, and our solidarity and condolences to Sweden. Madam President, first of all, I would like to stress that we came here not to discuss yesterday's strike by the US, but the consequences of a terrible, deadly chemical weapons attack last Tuesday. I also would like to draw attention of the distinguished colleagues to the statement of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine that states, inter alia, the following. Any use of chemical weapons is an outrageous violation of international law and constitutes a war crime. Perpetrators of such acts have to be brought to account. Impunity for a violator of international law, which resorts to use of chemical weapons, leads to further crimes on his part. Russia's chronic blocking of the work of the UN Security Council is unacceptable. The Syrian regime sponsors and advocates also bear responsibility for the use of weapons of mass destruction in Syria and subsequent deaths and sufferings among Syria's civilian population. The US actions must be supported to prevent the regime from committing any further war crimes, including against civilian population. Ukraine considers the US missile strike against a military target namely the air base from which an airstrike with the use of chemical weapons was launched against Han Shihun on the 4th of April, as an adequate and proportionate response. It is a clear signal that the use of weapons of mass destruction is not going to be tolerated anymore. Yesterday's events were long in the coming. For years, this Council was paralyzed on many important international security issues, including the Syrian file. For all intents and purposes, it was practically held hostage by one delegation that abused its status of a permanent member and practiced the approach of my way or no way. Council efforts to address the Syrian crisis were blocked by the Russian veto 7 times, 7 immobilizing vetoes, and thousands of dead eyes of Syrian children that will never see the light of day again. Everything and anything was employed to obstruct a meaningful action of the Council. Obfuscations, distractions, diversions, outright lies, and even bullying. As a result, despite the best efforts of the Council members, on numerous occasions the Council was not able to deliver because of intransigence of the Russian delegation. The Russian delegation claimed here that it suggested a balanced draft resolution. Ukraine does not consider the draft proposal proposed by the Russian delegation either as adequate to the circumstances or as proper reaction of the international community to the horrible mass murder of people in the Idlib province. Given the brutal facts on the ground, it is actually adding insult to injury. We cannot accept the reference to this crime as the alleged incident with the chemical weapons or reportedly causing large-scale loss of life. Really, an incident, reported loss of life? Does not the Russian delegation watch TV, or maybe it continues to assert that horrible footages from Han Shihun were staged? Furthermore, the draft suggests that the key focus of the international response to the use of weapons of mass destruction against civilians, instead of prompt identifying and bringing to justice perpetrators, and taking steps to prevent future attacks, should be limited to considering personal composition of the investigating team based on the principle of a broad-based and balanced geographical distribution. The terribly important issue. This is not serious. Such an approach is aimed at postponing practical investigation. Thus, we see this as a shameless attempt to undermine credibility of the Security Council. When the UN is unable to move, the resulting void is filled. As my delegation stated in this chamber just 2 days ago, endless talks cannot substitute concrete actions. We also reject the assertion by the Russian Federation that the US action constitutes an act of aggression. The Russian side has lost a moral ground to make such claims after its invasion of Georgia, occupation and attempted annexation of Crimea, and launching armed aggression against my country in the Donbas region, which continues until this day. The deafening sound of salvos of Russian Grad missiles and artillery shells pounding Ukraine's territory, bringing death and destruction, render hollow all Kremlin statements on the subject of respect for international law. At the very least, they are utterly hypocritical. I call on the Russian delegation to stop mockery of this Council and stop calling others paranoics. Rather look at yourself. Ukraine continues to believe that the final settlement of the Syrian conflict can be achieved through the political solution only. In light of the recent escalation, the only way forward is a reinvigorated political process, reanimation of the ceasefire, and a true commitment to the genuine political transition based on the Geneva Communiqué and Resolution 2254. Therefore, we urge the Syrian regime and its backers to think carefully before embarking on an escalatory ladder once again, and instead read the situation correctly in a way that would give a peace a chance. Dear colleagues, the events of this week sent a clear signal to all of us. The international community can ill afford a dysfunctional Security Council. A failure by this body to discharge its duties in an objective manner, to stand up for what is right, to ensure accountability for violators of international law, undermines its moral standing. Moreover, when time and energy of its members are dispensed in attempts to achieve unity and consensus by basically shielding perpetrators of most vicious crimes from responsibility, it destroys its credibility. I call on all of you to remember the Council's main task is not to achieve consensus on any given issue at any cost, but to work diligently and responsibly to maintain international peace and security. When the UN is found wanting, opportunistic and unscrupulous types will always rush in to explore open weaknesses to achieve their own political or other goals, thus creating more demand for a just and adequate response. If the UN persists in inaction, sooner or later this response will come from outside the UN system. Thus, obstructionists, whose identities are well known, have only themselves to blame for events not playing out according to their scenarios. I thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Ukraine. I shall now make my statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. For 6 years, the world has watched as the Syrian government and its leader, Bashar al-Assad, have terrorized its own people. It has murdered hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. It has broken international law and violated numerous UN resolutions. It has committed criminal acts that shock the conscience of all humanity. The international community has repeatedly expressed its outrage. The Joint Investigative Mechanism has found beyond any doubt that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons against its own people multiple times. On Tuesday, the Assad regime launched yet another chemical attack on civilians, murdering innocent men, women, and children in the most gruesome way. Assad did this because he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could get away with it because he knew Russia would have his back. That changed last night. As I warned on Wednesday, when the international community consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times when states are compelled to take their own action. The indiscriminate use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians is one of those times. The United States will not stand by when chemical weapons are used. It is in our vital national security interest to prevent the spread and use of chemical weapons. Our military destroyed the airfield from which this week's chemical strike took place. We were fully justified in doing so. The moral stain of the Assad regime could no longer go unanswered. His crimes against humanity could no longer be met with empty words. It was time to say enough, but not only say it, it was time to act. Bashar al-Assad must never use chemical weapons again, ever. Now, while the Syrian regime is responsible for the chemical weapons attack, it is not the only guilty party. The Iranian government bears a heavy responsibility. It has propped up and shielded Syria's brutal dictator for years. Iran continues to play a role in the bloodshed in Syria. The Russian government also bears considerable responsibility. Every time Assad has crossed the line of human decency, Russia has stood beside him. We had hoped the Security Council would move forward, but Russia made it known, as it has done 7 times before, that it would use its veto once again, covering up for the Assad regime. Further delay by compromising with Russia for a watered-down resolution would have only strengthened Assad. Strengthening Assad will only lead to more murders. We were not going to allow that. But it's even more than that. Russia is supposed to be a guarantor of the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. Think about that. Russia is supposed to have removed all the chemical weapons from Syria. But obviously, that has not happened, as innocent Syrians continue to be murdered in chemical attacks. Let's think about the possible reasons for Russia's failure. It could be that Russia is knowingly allowing chemical weapons to remain in Syria. It could be that Russia has been incompetent in its efforts to remove the chemical weapons. Or it could be that the Assad regime is playing the Russians for fools, telling them that there are no chemical weapons, all the while stockpiling them on their bases. The world is waiting for the Russian government to act responsibly in Syria. The world is waiting for Russia to reconsider its misplaced alliance with Bashar Assad. The United States will no longer wait for Assad to use chemical weapons without any consequences. Those days are over. But now we must move to a new phase, a drive toward a political solution to this horrific conflict. We expect the Syrian regime and its allies to take the UN political process seriously, something they have not done up until this point. We expect Russia and Iran to hold their ally accountable and abide by the terms of the ceasefire. We expect this council to speak loudly and forcefully when the regime or its allies undermine the political process, and countless of our own resolutions. The United States took a very measured step last night. We are prepared to do more, but we hope that will not be necessary. It is time for all civilized nations to stop the horrors that are taking place in Syria and demand a political solution. Thank you. I will now resume my function as the President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
At the outset, my delegation wishes to thank both the Russian Federation and Bolivia that joined us in calling for the convening of this urgent meeting. I have a question at the very outset to the Under-Secretary General, who stated that the Syrian Arab Republic perpetrated an act of aggression without defining that act by the terms of the Charter of the United Nations. The United States at 3:42 at dawn today, April 7, 2017, waged a barbaric, flagrant act of aggression against a base of the Syrian Arab Air Force in the central area of the country, using a number of missiles, which led to a number of martyrs, many injured, including women and children, and wide-ranging material damage. This treacherous act of aggression is a grave violation of the Charter of the United Nations, as well as all international norms and laws. The United States attempted to justify it with empty pretexts, fabricated arguments, claiming that the Syrian Arab Army had used chemical weapons in Khan Sheikhoun without genuine knowledge of what happened, without identifying who was responsible. The very same pretext shouted out by terrorist organizations, as well as their handlers in Washington, Ankara, Riyadh, Doha, Tel Aviv, London, and Paris, as well as their media. The Syrian Arab Republic has stressed that the Syrian Arab Army does not have chemical weapons in the first place, and that it would never use such weapons in any of its operations against armed terrorist groups, that it condemns the use of such weapons as being unjustified under any conditions. Let me stress that it is well known that those weapons have been used and stockpiled in many parts of Syria by terrorist armed organizations in cooperation, or rather with a wink and a nudge, by some ruling regimes in the region and outside, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some European states. They completely ignore all the facts and documented information on the use of chemical weapons by terrorists in many parts of the Syrian Arab Republic. This aggression would surely send erroneous messages to those terrorist groups, emboldening them to use chemical weapons in the future and to continue perpetrating terrorist acts against the Syrian civilians. Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL, both terrorist organizations and associated terrorist organizations, following this aggression, did wage many attacks on many parts of Syria. The Syrian Arab Army and its allies in the war against terrorism are confronting them, despite desperate attempts to support them. The American aggression is under this umbrella. This condemnable aggression is a grave extrapolation of the same erroneous American strategy that began 6 years ago, one of providing all forms of assistance to what the United States called moderate armed opposition groups. This strategy harms counterterrorism by the Syrian Arab Army and its partners. It makes the United States of America a partner of ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra and other terrorist groups that since day one of the unjust war against Syria have attacked army positions and military bases, as well as the infrastructure. Let me recall in this council that the United States of America leads a purported alliance against ISIL. However, the real achievement of that coalition is to kill civilians and to strike at infrastructure in Syria. Its real objective is to weaken the Syrian Arab Army and its allies when confronting terrorist groups. In this regard, we see the airstrike by the aircraft of this coalition illegally against the Syrian Arab Army in the Jabal Tharda in the city of Deir ez-Zor on 17 September 2017 in an attempt to protect ISIL elements falling between Syrian and Iraqi territory and opening a corridor for them. Today's aggression aimed at saving the Jabhat al-Nusra following the grave damage that was done to them by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies in the center of the country following their attack on cities and peaceful villages in the region. Let me also stress that media reports tell us that the U.S. Congress some time ago approved a law allowing the U.S. administration to send manpads to armed terrorist groups in Syria. We have warned only 2 days ago in this very council that these colonialist permanent member states in the Security Council, the three colonialists, have a renewed appetite to renew their lies and their stories that have been spread by the United States and the United Kingdom 14 years ago in this very hall to justify the destruction and occupation of Iraq, using a major lie being WMDs. Perhaps history has come full circle now in a regrettable scenario when we saw Secretary of State Colin Powell at the time trying to delude the international community and the United Nations to justify the aggression of his country against Iraq by talking about highly credible information. Today, the United States of America, in its policy, in an attempt to justify its aggression against Syria, is using fabricated information provided by the Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists. This aggression incontrovertibly proves that Syria has been correct. that successive American administrations will not change their sterile policies, which is to target states, to make peoples kneel to their will, and spread hegemony around the world. International public opinion, the people of the free world have no doubt that successive United States, UK, and French administrations for decades have not cared for democracy or freedom or human rights. Indeed, let alone the well-being of peoples or their security and stability. These are just pretexts to wage war, to occupy other states, to divide them, to control their wealth and energy resources. What is truly disgusting today is that these governments that supported the Wahhabi thinking, the terrorist, extremist ideology of the Al Saud entity since its creation, is today orchestrating terrorism and investing in it without any care for the lives of people, even their own peoples, when terrorism reached their own threshold because of these wrong and hypocritical policies. The Syrian Arab Republic strongly condemns the act of aggression by the United States of America, which is counter to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations, indeed with the status of the United States as a permanent member of the Security Council, which is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, let alone that these aggressions really promise total chaos in many parts of the world and will make the law of the jungle the only way to deal with the regional and economic crises without any heed to the Charter of the United Nations. When you killed millions of innocents, starting in South Asia all the way through Latin America, what was your position? The member from France spoke on the issue and spoke about exceptions. You should not be the exception. You should be made accountable for the killings in July of 2017 of hundreds by your warplanes. You in the international coalition must be held accountable for the killing of 800 civilians in Syria at the beginning of 2017. You must be made accountable for your support of armed terrorist groups and political cover thereto as they continue their terrorist acts. The government of the Syrian Arab Republic, proceeding from its belief that all efforts must be mobilized to combat terrorism, as it respects the rules of international law, the Charter of the United Nations calls on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities according to the Charter, to condemn this act of aggression and to ensure that it shall not be repeated. It is an act that threatens peace and security in the region and the world.
I acknowledge the statement from the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor again to make a further statement.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, I'm taking the floor again just to say that I would have asked the speakers from the US and other delegations not to insult my country. Now, there is no moral right to do so. We do not do so. And I'd like to just say that Ms. Haley has just assumed her new office, that she does have a genuine opportunity, and as the permanent representative of the US and member of the Security Council, to establish a healthy, collective work environment in the Security Council. But this will not be done if you give the national point of view on what is absolute truth. I'd like, first of all, to ensure that we have mutually respectful work in the Security Council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the representative of the Russian Federation. There are no more speakers on the list. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.